ships came out, got sent around the office, and we challenged everyone to go out and try and make the top 10 sci-fi spacecraft and see if we could do it with the parts that we had. And I think we were pretty successful.
And I mean, and again, we can't actually ship with these vehicles.
The parts.
We can ship the parts, but it's pretty satisfying to like fly around in your X-wing fighter and blow up the Enterprise. I mean,
yeah, actually, the genre mixing in this game is hilarious because you can basically end up with an interstellar war between the Care Bears and the Klingons. You know, because the players fit both ways.
So this is a little snapshot of the library of parts that we put together for our building editor initially, and we've since made the parts much more kind of tangible and realistic and less sort of abstract and platonic. But just to give you a sense of that, this was an early visualization that I did, trying to get a sense of what it might be like to transform and deform these various parts. So this was a quick Maya mock-up where we were thinking we want to have these parts, but we want the parts to be kind of playful and toy-like and have a lot of range of possibilities with them. So this was kind of the first visualization of that. And
yeah, what you're seeing here is the handles. As the player picks out one of these blocks, they can stretch the handles and achieve any of these shapes. So these are showing all the different kind of morph interpolations.
So just working as a CG artist, one of the things that's a lot of fun is if a rigger rigs something for you, you have all these handles, and you can pull the handles, and the character will do some interesting things. You know, pull the handle, and it'll smile. You know, there's a little button that'll change its pose. And those are kind of fun as toys, and it always seemed like that should be exposed to the player too. I mean, it seems like those are kind of cool metaphors in toys where the thing becomes this tangible little puppet that dances to your movements. And so one of the things we wanted to do was expose kind of the joy of, I wouldn't say the joy of rigging, but maybe the joy of manipulating things with rigs to the player. And this is, again, concept artist went through and did a whole batch of what might some of our crazy buildings look like. Let's see. And this was a very early mock-up where we're trying to get a sense of how the building editor was going to work. And really, it's kind of stacking blocks or Legos with sort of deceptively tricky work to do to make the whole thing deform properly with deformations. And then this was, ignore this part, this was an idea that we could do some stylistic variation procedurally, and it turned out to be too big of a pain. Let's see. Just a quick example of one of our buildings. Planets are another case that's kind of interesting because the player's going to fly around in the galaxy. We never want them to see a repeated planet. But the planets, when they're unpacked, are, you know, they're 6 512 textures times 3. The planets are like 8 megabytes each. You know, we can't ship with, you know, 100,000 of those on a disk. And so we've got this similar scheme to the creature painting thing, where these little particles crawl around the creature and can, you know, reason about it and decide what goes where with planets. And so we've got these little agents that say, I make mountains, and so I'm going to drive around and make mountains, and other ones make canyons, and other ones make oceans, and other ones make continents. So we've made this little...
Yeah, the planets were a particular challenge for us because the gameplay has occurred so many different scales on this planet. You're down ground level as a creature or walking across this huge planet, but later in the game we have to be able to pull out, and the whole planet is now kind of this toy. And not only that, but the player eventually is going to edit the planet at the terraforming stage of the UFO. We wanted basically the user to have the ability to play with these very powerful tools, almost like clay. The KidPix was kind of our model for this. This is an old paint program for kids. And the tools in KidPix were just very surprising, fun to use, kind of emergent tools.
And the resultant planet has to take up, you know, maybe we might have 10K for it, something like that, and the whole thing has to sort of uncompress once you get it out into the player's universe. Crazy ideas for planets. We had all these artists do all this visualization of what some of our strange planets might be like. And we wanted to, again, get a breadth from scary planets to playful planets, all, again, in the same kind of consistent aesthetic universe. So here are a couple examples of once you set these little agents loose on the planet and say, go carve an ocean, go build some mountains, what do you get?
This is actually an interesting kind of thing where what we learned in the texture scripting on the creatures turned out to be a very useful kind of conceptual framework for how we would do procedural terraforming of the planets.
Right. And the player's doing the same thing. You know, they're basically invoking these little things, and they crawl around the planet and make volcanoes and stuff like that. Just a quick example. So again, the planet has to look good when you're looking at the thing from over here, and then when you go all the way down over here, it can't fall apart. So we've got this giant level of detail problem. So here's an example of what one of the planets looks like once you get down to ground level and are playing the creature game. And they've got to exist across all these states because the player might come back with his UFO and heat it up with a heat ray, and then the thing gets all lava-y, and then they kind of freeze it with a freeze ray, and then they whisk up all the atmosphere.
To explain this really quickly, any planet that the player made or the computer generated also had to transition through this state space that might happen depending on how you're modifying the climate in the space game. So this middle planet is kind of in balance in terms of
And these are the same planet, just going through different states. You can see the same landforms.
Yeah, so basically it's cold to hot in that dimension, and then it's very thick atmosphere to vacuum, top to bottom. And so that's one planet making the transition through that space.
And so that was tricky, trying to get the whole thing to, just fit in a shader from the first case, but then make it so that something could look good as it transitioned across this landscape of ice ages to lava planets and stuff like that.
It's like at all sizes and at all states.
Yes, zoom in, zoom out, make it generate in 200 milliseconds, and make it transition across all these states. And then we have to populate the planets with stuff, rocks and giant toadstools and skeletons of dead animals and stuff like that. So here's an example of, if you go down, this is an early prototype. If you go down to a planet, the giant Swiss cheese planet, we thought maybe that might be a good idea. And here's what it looks like if you go down. And then this whole system for generating these planets has to be fully proceduralized. So this was a flowchart that I did showing you start with a height field, then how do you get from there to something that looks professionally textured, looks like it was designed by a level designer, and has an atmosphere, and so you can zoom down and it's day sometimes and it's night sometimes. And this was an early prototype visualizing how that would work, where when you're looking down at the planet, it's got this sort of diaphanous blanket of atmosphere and the sun flares through it, and then when you get all the way down to the ground looking up, it becomes this opaque blanket of atmosphere overhead. So we had to solve all these kind of problems, these technical problems that aren't, none of them are insurmountable. They're obviously all like, oh, I could come up with some ideas for that. But boy, it was just one after another. And then here's another visualization of all the different states that planets can be in. The planets that are really hot because they're close to the sun need to look baking. And then you have like these planets that are fantasy planets with little curlicues and swirls on them. And then you've got dead moon planets, gas giants. And you have a distribution of like a histogram of how many planets and how many potential planets can exist in the universe, and are more of them kind of like Mars or Earth, or more of them kind of like the Smurf planet.
Yeah, as you're flying around discovering planets, we wanted some of the really unusual planets to feel like treasures you discovered. And they're very, very rare